On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. The attack caused huge damage, and many lives were lost. Before the attack, the U.S. was not part of World War II. However, after the attack, the country declared war on Japan. This changed the course of the war. Japan had planned the attack in secret. They wanted to weaken the U.S. Navy so they could take over more land in Asia without much resistance. The Japanese sent aircraft carriers near Hawaii. From these ships, they launched hundreds of planes. The planes carried bombs and torpedoes to destroy U.S. ships and planes. The attack came in two waves. The first wave hit battleships and airfields. The second wave caused more damage to ships and buildings. In total, 8 battleships were damaged, and over 180 U.S. planes were destroyed. Many sailors and soldiers were killed, and the U.S. Navy suffered heavy losses. The attack shocked the American people. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. The next day, the U.S. joined the war. This attack was one of the most important events in history. It led to a long and deadly war between the U.S. and Japan. Today, Pearl Harbor is remembered as a symbol of bravery. Many people visit the memorial to honor those who lost their lives. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan and the U.S. had growing tensions. Japan wanted more land and resources, but the U.S. tried to stop its expansion. Japan had invaded China in the 1930s. The U.S. did not agree with this and supported China. This made Japan see the U.S. as an enemy. The U.S. put economic sanctions on Japan. This meant Japan could not buy oil, steel, and other goods. This made it hard for Japan to continue its war. Japan needed oil to keep its army and navy strong. It planned to take land in Asia to get these resources. The U.S. tried to stop Japan's plans. The U.S. and Japan had many meetings to find a peaceful solution. The U.S. wanted Japan to leave China, but Japan refused to do so. In November 1941, the U.S. sent the Hull Note. This document demanded that Japan leave China and stop its expansion. Japan saw this as a threat. While these talks happened, Japan had already decided to attack the U.S. It sent its navy toward Pearl Harbor in secret. Japan believed that a surprise attack would stop the U.S. from fighting back. This led to the deadly attack on December 7, 1941. The tensions between Japan and the U.S. finally turned into war. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed history forever. Japan spent months planning the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the leader of the plan. He wanted to weaken the U.S. Navy. Japan knew that the U.S. had a strong fleet. If Japan attacked first, it could take control of the Pacific before the U.S. could react. The attack had to be a surprise. If the U.S. knew about it, they could prepare for war. The Japanese Navy trained in secret for months. The Japanese Navy made special weapons for the attack. They created torpedoes that could work in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Pilots practiced bombing ships and airfields. They studied the U.S. base carefully to know where to attack. The attack was planned in 2 waves. The first wave would target battleships, and the second wave would destroy anything left. In November 1941, Japan sent 6 aircraft carriers with over 400 planes toward Hawaii. The fleet took a long route to avoid being seen. The fleet stayed silent. No radio messages were sent so that the U.S. would not know they were coming. On December 6th, the fleet was close to Pearl Harbor. The attack would begin early the next morning. The U.S. had no idea what was coming. On December 7th, 1941, at 6 a.m., the Japanese fleet was near Hawaii. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave of planes attacked Pearl Harbor. The American sailors were not expecting an attack. Many were still sleeping or getting ready for the day when the bombs started falling. The first wave had 183 Japanese planes. They included bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes. Their goal was to destroy U.S. battleships and air bases. The Japanese hit the U.S. battleships first. A torpedo hit USS Oklahoma, making it capsize. USS Arizona was struck and exploded. Bombs hit airfields, destroying U.S. planes before they could take off. Hangars were also damaged, making it hard to fight back. Many sailors and pilots tried to defend the base. They used machine guns to shoot at enemy planes, but they were outnumbered. 30 minutes later, a second wave of 171 Japanese planes arrived. They targeted more ships and buildings, causing even greater damage. Some American pilots managed to take off and fight back. They shot down a few Japanese planes, but the attack was too strong. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. The U.S. had lost 8 battleships, 180 aircraft, and more than 2,000 lives. Smoke filled the air, and fires burned on the ships. Many sailors were trapped inside sinking vessels and could not escape. Hospitals were full of wounded soldiers. The survivors worked hard to put out fires and rescue people from the wreckage. The attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the worst in U.S. history. It changed the world forever. The attack on Pearl Harbor caused panic and confusion. Many soldiers and sailors tried to fight back, but they were not prepared. Some American pilots managed to take off and shoot down Japanese planes. Others fired from ships and ground positions. Despite their bravery, the damage was too great. Most U.S. battleships were sunk or badly damaged, and many aircraft were destroyed. The attack ended in less than 2 hours. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and more than 1,000 were wounded. Hospitals were filled with injured soldiers. Doctors and nurses worked day and night to help the survivors. Many sailors were trapped in sinking ships. Rescue teams worked for days to save those who were still alive. News of the attack spread quickly. People across the U.S. were shocked and angry. They demanded action against Japan. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke to Congress the next day. He called December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The U.S. declared war on Japan on December 8th. This event led the U.S. to join World War II on the side of the Allies. The American people united after the attack. Many men joined the military, ready to fight in the war. Factories started making more weapons, ships, and planes. The U.S. prepared for a long and difficult battle. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed history. It pushed the U.S. into World War II and led to many important events. The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the world. It changed the course of World War II and led to major global events. The U.S. declared war on Japan on December 8, 1941. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. This meant the U.S. was now fully involved in World War II. It joined the Allies, fighting against Japan, Germany, and Italy. Before the attack, many Americans did not want to join the war. But after Pearl Harbor, the country was united in its decision. Britain had already been fighting Germany and Italy. Winston Churchill, the British leader, was happy to have the U.S. as an ally. The Soviet Union was also at war with Germany. The U.S. joining the fight helped the Allies gain more strength. The attack also affected Asia. Japan continued to invade countries like the Philippines and Singapore after Pearl Harbor. The U.S. and its allies started fighting Japan across the Pacific. Battles took place on islands and in the ocean. The war in the Pacific lasted for years. Many soldiers and civilians lost their lives in the battles that followed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a turning point in history. It made the war even bigger and changed the world forever. The U.S. became one of the most powerful nations in the war. Its factories and soldiers helped the Allies win. The attack caused great destruction, but it also led to a united effort to stop aggression and bring peace. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a success for Japan at first, but it also had serious mistakes. These mistakes changed the war. Japan's main goal was to destroy the U.S. Navy. They damaged battleships, but they missed key targets that could help America recover. The oil storage tanks, submarine base, and repair docks were not attacked. These places were very important for the U.S. war effort. Another mistake was that U.S. aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor during the attack. They were at sea on other missions. Aircraft carriers became the most important ships in World War II. The US used them to fight back against Japan. If Japan had destroyed these carriers, the US would have needed more time to rebuild its navy and plan attacks. The attack also made Americans determined to fight. Before Pearl Harbor, many did not want to join the war. After the attack, people united. Many joined the military, and factories worked day and night to make weapons. Japan had hoped to weaken the US, but instead, it made the country stronger and more focused on winning the war. Japan also thought the war would be short, but it lasted much longer. The US fought back with full force. The battles in the Pacific became harder for Japan. They lost many ships, soldiers, and resources over time. In the end, the attack on Pearl Harbor led to Japan's defeat. Its biggest mistake was waking up a stronger enemy. The attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the most important events in history. It changed the world and affected many lives. After the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave a famous speech. He called December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. His words became well known. They showed how deeply the attack had hurt the American people and how it pushed them into war. Over the years, people have worked to keep the memory of Pearl Harbor alive. Many visit the site to learn about what happened. The USS Arizona Memorial was built to honor those who died. It stands over the sunken ship, where many sailors are still buried. Every year, on December 7th, people gather to remember the attack. They hold ceremonies to honor the brave men and women. The attack also taught important lessons. It showed the dangers of being unprepared and the need for strong defense. The U.S. military improved after the attack. They made better plans to stop future surprise attacks. Pearl Harbor remains a symbol of courage. It reminds people of the cost of war and the strength to rebuild after a great loss. Today, Japan and the U.S. are no longer enemies. They became strong allies after World War II ended. The two nations now work together for peace and security. They have learned from the past. The attack on Pearl Harbor will always be remembered. It is a lesson in history that should never be forgotten.